Hello, strangers from distant lands. What up, friends of old? Mackenzie here, humbly at your service. You've been summoned today to hear me wax poetic about the Lord of the Rings fandom renaissance that happened on Twitter between 2020 and 2022. Why, you might ask? Because I want to.
I'm a big girl now. I'm a big girl now. This my food I want. I'm a big girl now.
Alright, let's open up this pit. This fandom is old. Very old. Old as balls. And it experiences cycles of activity. For instance, the release of the Peter Jackson films between 2001 and 2003 saw a massive uptick in Lord of the Rings fan activity online. The fandom has basically been simmering ever since, sometimes active, sometimes dormant, but really and truly, the release of those movies in the early 2000s did a lot for digital Tolkien fandom. We saw fan sites popping up, we saw wikis being populated and built out, IRC chats, pages and pages of forum discussion, fan art, fanfic, all of it. So when I saw Lord of the Rings trending on Twitter in 2020, I was like, let me take a closer look at this. It was like the periodical cicada when it wakes up and goes crazy.
After an absence of 17 years, the forest is now overrun by cicadas.
It felt like the feverish enthusiasm of that early 2000s Lord of the Rings fandom that got me engaged with it initially. It felt like a renaissance. Like, this resurgence was huge, it was bonkers, and it was not associated with any adaptation. Like, this was years after the Hobbit movies came out, and quite a while before Rings of Power discourse started happening. But, like, Lord of the Rings was trending on Twitter, mainstream, every day. In like March and April, I would open Twitter and see Lord of the Rings trending, and I was like, what's going on? What am I missing? But it was just people in lockdown during COVID feeling like they were losing their minds and like seeking comfort in familiar places. And Lord of the Rings does scratch that itch for a lot of people, so it made sense. And I started paying really close attention to it. I made a list and I started following people, and I became obsessed with this period of fan activity. Mostly because it brought queer readings of Tolkien's work to the mainstream in a way that I have not seen in my 20+ years of participation in this fandom. It was thrilling. It was so exciting. It really made me feel the same way as, like, you know, Googling pictures of Legolas at 3 a.m. on my parents' dial-up connection in 2001 and finding people who love the thing that I love and joining the community and being welcomed into it and being able to like take part in conversations and have different discourse and share headcanons and do everything that you do in a fandom space. But now queer people were getting involved and making themselves visible and doing shitposts and fanfic and fan art and close readings and critical thought and doing queer shipping and making it like legit, like bringing it to the fore. Queer people are here in the Tolkien fandom. We've always been here, but I had never really seen queer interpretations of Tolkien's work in the mainstream so consistently, and it was, again, very exciting. Like, really cool to see, very encouraging and dope, and awesome, and sick and ill, and it bops and it slaps and whatever. But it did also garner some backlash from less queer-friendly members of the fandom, let's say. You would have queer people posting whatever they wanted to post that day, doing their thing, and you would get pretty much a broken record of criticisms of queer fan activity. Like, you're destroying Tolkien's legacy! He's rolling in his grave! You're ruining Tolkien for the rest of us! Why don't you respect the lore? Respect the lore! And this backlash came from more conservative, more religious, more traditionally minded fans of Tolkien. So I'm calling them trad fans as a shorthand. So we have these two groups of fans, queer fans and trad fans, and I think their interactions with both the fandom online and the source text of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work raise a number of questions about who owns the Lord of the Rings story and how we're supposed to read it. Like, is involving Tolkien in your interpretation of his work the right thing to do? Is invoking his legacy correct? What was his intent, and does his intent really matter? We're going to explore this today by drawing on reader response theory and reception theory to lend some context, and by delving into Tolkien's stated intent and the texts themselves in an attempt to respect the lore. So please, make sure you've packed your frying pan and your very special salt. Check how much elven whey bread we've got left, and I'll see if I can find us some rope, because we're going on an adventure, babe. Come on. Reader response theory, put simply, emphasizes the reader's experience of a literary work rather than focusing on the author's intent. Roland Barthes' Death of the Author is a notable and popular example of reader response theory that I would be surprised if you have not yet heard of it, but today we're going to expand on those ideas by taking a look at Wolfgang Iser and Stuart Hall. Wolfgang Iser was some guy from a small town in Germany, and in the 1960s he developed his contributions to reader response theory. He highlights the significance of a personal relationship to a text. The act of reading is individual and unique. It's a conversation between the individual and the author/speaker, and this makes space for different people to read the same text or view the same film, media, etc. in different ways. Groundbreaking stuff, I know. According to Iser, leaving the comfort zone of the self and drawing on both known and unknown experience to relate to a text is the exciting, beating heart of what makes the act of reading engaging. The work itself is a consciousness, separate from the life story of the author and the lived experience of the reader. This consciousness is formed at the point at which author, reader, and story meet. The work itself must be thought of as a consciousness, because only in this way is there an adequate basis for the author-reader relationship, a relationship that can only come about through the negation of the author's own life story and the reader's own disposition. Iser is emphasizing the idea that meaning is not inherent within a text, but that a text is instead given meaning through its interaction with and relationship to the reader. Readers are individuals, meaning they're situated in different ways according to their backgrounds and experiences. The work of art, or the meaning within a text, occurs at the point where the text and the reader converge. If a book is written in a forest and no one's around to read it, does it have any meaning? The takeaway here is that different people can read the same text in different ways, and we're going to look at another cultural theory to contextualize different ways of reading. Cultural studies scholar and generally cool dude Stuart Hall developed his encoding and decoding model of communication in the early 1970s. He talks about encoding and decoding in the televisual discourse, but I think these concepts also apply to reading and texts. For our purposes, encoding is the production of an idea through words and symbols. Decoding is reconstructing that idea through interpreting and understanding. The author or writer is the encoder, the reader or the audience is the decoder. The act of crafting a text is an act of encoding. The act of reading a text is an act of decoding. Encoding and decoding do not necessarily align with one another. As Hall puts it, the degree of symmetry, or the degrees of understanding and misunderstanding in the communicative exchange, depend on the degrees of symmetry or asymmetry and relations of equivalence established between the positions of the personifications, those being encoder-producer and decoder-receiver. The encoder can try to encode and send a specific message through a text, but whether it will be decoded in the intended way is not guaranteed. And to be clear, this is exciting. Hall recognizes and highlights that the encoder may be operating from a different cultural or social position than the decoder, and so the message may be decoded in a way that's different than what was intended by the encoder. Since there is no necessary correspondence between encoding and decoding, the former can attempt to prefer, but cannot prescribe or guarantee the latter, which has its own conditions of existence. Unless they are wildly aberrant, encoding will have the effect of constructing some of the limits and parameters within which decodings will operate. If there were no limits, audiences could simply read whatever they liked into any message.
Look at that door, dude. See that door right there? One marked pirate. You think a pirate lives in there? I see a door marked private. Is that the door you're talking about? No, I was talking.
Yeah.
I didn't say.
No,
Did you? What did you hear?
I heard you say you saw a door marked pirate. And
Yes,
is there a
that's what I
pirate
thought-
living in there?
No, see, that's
How
not
could
what
there
I'm
be a
saying.
pirate
Well,
living
look,
in
are we
a
going to talk
Korean
about
restaurant?
pirates all day? We're going to find out what lives in here.
No doubt, some total misunderstandings of this kind do exist, but the vast range must contain some degree of reciprocity between encoding and decoding moments. Otherwise, we could not speak of an effective communicative exchange at all. Nevertheless, this correspondence is not given but constructed. It is not natural but the product of an articulation between two distinct moments. So in this framework, effective communication occurs when the message is received and understood by the decoder as intended by the encoder. And let's be clear here, we're not talking about authorial intent, but we're focusing on the message of a text and the various ways in which that message can be decoded. So Hall identifies three positions from which decodings can be constructed. We have the dominant or hegemonic code. Hegemonic? Hegemony? Hegemony? Hegemonic? The dominant code, where the decoder takes the meaning directly and decodes the message in terms of the reference code in which it has been encoded. In other words, the intended message was encoded by the dominant class, and the decoder is also part of the dominant point of view. The encoder and the decoder share the same cultural biases, so the message is decoded as intended. So for instance, if we're looking at Lord of the Rings, a dominant decoding of Lord of the Rings may associate Frodo and Sam with an officer and a bat boy, as is often proclaimed, or they may turn to allegories of religion and wartime in an effort to understand the message, as Tolkien is generally perceived to have been a deeply religious ex-soldier who also happened to be super horny for linguistics and legend. Next, we have the negotiated code, where the decoder operates with exceptions to the rule, negotiating a code that acknowledges the dominant message but does not completely accept it the way the encoder intended. The preferred meaning is generally accepted by the decoder, but it is modified and rejected in places to reflect the decoder's own experiences and biases. So a negotiated decoding of Lord of the Rings may make space for Frodo and Sam, or Legolas and Gimli, to give some attention to one of my favorite canonical ships, to be more than strictly platonic. But it stops at the tentative, the kind of tenuous, the little tongue-in-cheek suggestion that Tolkien accidentally wrote a little gay romance into his very serious fantasy book. Tolkien's cultural bias is taken into account, but it's a little bit warped, a little bit slanted, to make space for queer people to enjoy his work. And finally, we have the oppositional code. Hall states that it is possible for a viewer perfectly to understand both the literal and the connotative inflection given by a discourse, but to decode the message in a globally contrary way. Basically, the decoder's social situation places them in an oppositional relationship to the dominant code. The decoder understands the encoder's message and the text's meaning, but they do not share the cultural biases that shape the encoding of the text. For instance, an oppositional decoding of Lord of the Rings by a queer person may view Frodo and Sam as fully, openly in love with each other in a super gay way. And Tolkien's potential cultural bias is set aside entirely in favor of a queer reading of his work. As Hall says, one of the most significant political moments is the point when events which are normally signified and decoded in a negotiated way begin to be given an oppositional reading. So we have these modes of decoding, these ways of reading, and we understand that both the process of encoding and the process of decoding are personal experiences, individual moments of consciousness generated between the author, the reader, and the text or story itself. Iser's theory and Hall's theory, when synthesized, make for a helpful framework for looking at interpretative differences within fandom spaces. Both of these theories view the act of reading as indeed active, as a process of participatory creativity. As Iser notes, reading is only a pleasure when it is active and creative. Now, pleasure. That's a good word, isn't it? Pleasure. Something nice, something pleasing, a sensation familiar and yet difficult to describe, a sense of happy satisfaction, of enjoyment, something intended for entertainment and indulgence, a phenomenon one chases in hopes of replication. This conception of pleasure as an aspect of the reading experience is one that directly concerns Tolkien. So let's let him back into the room. So earlier, I was talking about these two groups of fans that I recognized when I started paying attention to the Twitter fandom renaissance, as I'm calling it. We have queer fans and we have trad fans, and I didn't have to try very hard to draw a distinction between them, as they demonstrate different levels of engagement with Tolkien and with his work. Queer fans seem to have absolutely no issue separating Tolkien the man from the lore when they participate in fandom and create fan works. They find and see themselves in the text and participate in fandom to find other people who relate in a similar way and build community around sharing this experience. Their interest, at least in the majority, is in the text itself. Queer fans often quote from the text of Lord of the Rings directly in their tweets and fan art, and they demonstrate a careful loyalty to the lore. In this most recent renaissance of Lord of the Rings fandom online, Sam Frodo emerged as the most popular romantic pairing, with plenty of direct textual support to back it up. For example, the samfrodo.text bot on Twitter exists solely to tweet out the tenderest and softest passages between Frodo and Sam, and all of that content is pulled directly from the text. Rather than existing as an implication, an undercurrent, or a suggestion, reading this pairing of Frodo and Sam as wholly and unapologetically gay became mainstream in Tolkien fandom on Twitter, and this is the oppositional reading that transforms a negotiated decoding into an active political discourse. On the other hand, trad fans also gather online to appreciate Tolkien's work, but they tend to conflate the lore with Tolkien the man. Who they think he was and what they think he believed directly influences their own way of relating to the text. The majority of homophobic and queerphobic backlash from trad fans against queer fans tends to be structured around a vague and tenuous argument that Tolkien was Catholic, and therefore none of this text can be read in a gay way. This implies that Tolkien's Catholicism is essential to a valid reading of Lord of the Rings, because it implies that the author and the text should not be separated. Tolkien's Catholicism is so important to trad fans. They learn that Tolkien was Catholic and take that to mean that he shared their exact belief system to the letter with no nuance when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. Trad fans view Tolkien's Catholicism as antithetical to any possibility for homosexual or otherwise queer readings of the text, and insist that he would be rolling in his grave to see how people are interpreting his work, and that any discussion of Tolkien that includes or considers queer people is disrespectful to his legacy. So let's bring Hall back in here as well. We can pretty easily designate trad fans as operating within the dominant code, because they're operating from within a similar cultural bias as Tolkien himself when he wrote the text, and queer fans as operating within an oppositional code. We're queer people. Our discourse is political by default because we operate within a code that is inherently opposed to the hegemony. Because queer discourse became so visible and so mainstream on Twitter between 2020 and 2022, political discourse was bound to follow. Decoders operating within the dominant code simply could not abide the oppositional decoders' insistence that Frodo and Sam are gay, that Lord of the Rings is indeed a queer text, and that Tolkien's lore happens to support this reading, whether the man himself did or not. More on that in a moment. For a salient example of this reactionary impulse, let's go back to 2021. When the Tolkien Society, an international literary society and fan club founded in 1969, announced the name and program of their 2021 seminar, Tolkien and Diversity, trad fans took the opportunity to show up in droves and really let loose, offering insults and slurs, threats of harassment, unexamined hypocrisy, and gleefully indulged queerphobia in the replies and quote tweets. And again, we see repetition of phrases like "stop defiling Tolkien's legacy" and "he's rolling in his grave," and we see queer fans directed over and over to respect the lore. So when trad fans say respect the lore, I think they mean respect my personal idea of who Tolkien was and how he wanted us to read his work. Like, they don't seem to be super familiar with the lore. I don't know if they read it. Trad fans cling to Tolkien's Catholicism as a justification for bigotry and homophobia because they feel that queer people enjoying Lord of the Rings somehow ruins it for them, like they aren't able to read the text and enjoy it knowing that queer people see themselves in it. A fantasy world, right? A fairy story with wizards and halflings and elves and rings of power. It simply does not have space for queer people, and Trad fans would much prefer if the fandom didn't either. They're stuck in the dominant code, and they can't see any other possible way of interpreting or understanding Tolkien. They'll insist that queer fans must have only watched the movies and never read the books, which is funny considering how often queer fans directly quote from the text, but Trad fans willfully ignore or misinterpret Tolkien's own words in an effort to justify their feelings about his work. I think it's a bit misguided, this impulse to bring Tolkien into the room and point at him as a justification for being an asshole to other Tolkien fans. And let me tell you why. Hall's reception theory highlights the very real idea that different people are capable of reading the same text in different ways based on their cultural biases and social situation. Different people bring themselves and their experiences to a text and that affects their reading of the text? Wow, Mom! It follows then that any interpretation, any decoding of Tolkien's work, specifically The Lord of the Rings, is not necessarily wrong or right. They're just reflections of the different codes in which readers can interpret and understand the text before them. And the beauty of this particular text of Lord of the Rings is that it has such breadth and depth that if you're really looking for something, you will likely find it. That's part of why paying attention to this fandom is so rewarding, and it's part of why I'm able to talk with you about it today. Individual readers experience this text in different ways and for different reasons. I start to take issue with Trad fans when they insist on bringing Tolkien into any and every conversation about Lord of the Rings. They're obsessed with his biography, his faith, his background, his upbringing. You'd think that they would be experts on the thing they speak so adamantly about. The thing, though, is that if you insist on invoking the man himself, the professor, Jolkien, Rolkien, Rokin, Tolkien, you'd better do your research. So, in the prologue to the second edition of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien gives some background on hobbits and what and who they are, talks about pipeweed, details the governmental structure of the Shire, provides kind of like a last time on Middle-earth with some information on how the One Ring was found, and closes out with a note on the Shire records. And we're going to dig into that a little bit. In this note on the Shire records, Tolkien is careful to outline the nature of the text ahead. This account of the end of the Third Age is drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch, which was in origin Bilbo's private diary, and whose pages Frodo nearly filled with his account of the War of the Ring. He goes on to detail the copies of the book made for the use of the descendants of the children of Master Samwise, and at the request of the great-grandson of Peregrine. All told, it is probable that several hobbits and at least one Gondorian scribe are responsible for preserving the story that Tolkien dutifully compiled into the Lord of the Rings text. This positions Tolkien as a translator or compiler, not the writer or ultimate authority of Lord of the Rings. He has here purposefully distanced himself from the text. This distance is inbuilt and inherent to the quality of the story. He is simply a compiler or a translator, not the direct speaker or owner. This is within the canon of the text itself, a fun kind of meta-text moment for Tolkien to say, "Don't look at me. I just did the research and cobbled this together so y'all can read it." The existence of the Red Book within the Lord of the Rings story, and its complicated history as laid out in the prologue, speak to its utility as a meaningful tool to separate Tolkien the man from the lore. If you're interested or invested in his intent in this work, which is different from his personal belief system by the way, you should know what that intent was and is. There are layers of arguments around Tolkien's Catholicism and its influence on his work, but regardless, he was consistently insistent that his intent in Lord of the Rings was not allegorical in any way. This is the part with the receipts, by the way, so let's do our taxes. Tolkien wrote in a draft of a letter to Hungarian author Peter Szabo, One of my strongest opinions is that the investigation of an author's biography, or such other glimpses of his personality as can be gleaned by the curious, is an entirely vain and false approach to his works. When Tolkien speaks of merely glimpsing a writer's personality from their known biography, he means that affixing labels to writers, living or dead, is an inept procedure. It distracts attention from what is individual and not classifiable in each of them. He is very clearly here reinforcing his well-known insistence that Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. As he states in the foreword to the second edition of the text, as for any inner meaning or message it has in the intention of the author, none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. Projecting his belief system onto the text was not his intention. To return to his drafted letter, he writes that he cannot understand how he should be labeled a believer in moral didacticism. Who by? It is in any case the exact opposite of my procedure in The Lord of the Rings. I neither preach nor teach. Elsewhere in his letters, Tolkien continues to insist not only that he dislikes allegory, but also that he had very little particular, conscious, intellectual intention in mind at any point. And he footnotes this by saying something really interesting. Take the Ents, for instance. I did not consciously invent them at all. The chapter called Treebeard, from Treebeard's first remark on page 66, was written off more or less as it stands, with an effect on myself, except for labor pains, almost like reading someone else's work. And I like Ents now because they do not seem to have anything to do with me. I dare say something had been going on in the unconscious for some time, and that accounts for my feeling throughout, especially when stuck, that I was not inventing but reporting, imperfectly, and had at times to wait till what really happened came through. Tolkien wrote in a letter in 1951, an equally basic passion of mine ab initio was for myth, not allegory, and for fairy story, and above all for heroic legend on the brink of fairy tale and history, of which there is far too little in the world, accessible to me, for my appetite. There was Greek and Celtic and Romanche and Germanic and Scandinavian and Finnish, which greatly affected me, but nothing English, save impoverished chapbook stuff. Of course there was and is all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain but not with English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. For one thing, its fairy is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another, and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary, real world. So in this letter, Tolkien is saying, I wanted to write a legend. I wanted to have a myth that felt particularly, specifically English. And you can say, yeah, we have the Arthurian legend, sure. But that text in Tolkien's mind is too explicitly Christian. It's too explicitly religious. And he didn't find that to be satisfying. So he wrote his own. Are we sensing what I'm getting at here? Okay, great. There's more. In 1954, Tolkien wrote, there is of course a clash between literary technique and the fascination of elaborating in detail an imaginary mythical age. Mythical, not allegorical. My mind does not work allegorically. In 1955, Tolkien wrote, there is a great deal of linguistic matter, other than actually Elvish names and words, included or mythologically expressed in the book. It is, to me anyway, largely an essay in linguistic aesthetic, as I sometimes say to people who ask me, what is it all about? It is not about anything but itself. Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political. I am in any case myself a Christian, but the Third Age was not a Christian world. I don't know how much unpacking I have to do here. It seems like the laundry's already been done and folded and returned to its dresser, because I think it's pretty clear that Tolkien is continually reinforcing, this is not an allegory. I did not include religion in this text. Please do not include religion in my text. It's not a Christian story. It has no allegorical intentions, including religious allegory. He's being very explicit in these letters. So I'm sure you can understand my frustration. In 1956, Tolkien wrote, "I have long ceased to invent. I wait till I seem to know what really happened, or till it writes itself. Thus, though I knew for years that Frodo would run into a tree adventure somewhere far down the great river, I have no recollection of inventing Ents. I came at last to the point, and wrote the Treebeard chapter without any recollection of any previous thought, just as it now is. And then I saw that, of course, it had not happened to Frodo at all." So here again, Tolkien is demonstrating his sense of detachment from this text and recognizing himself as like a channel for the story to flow through. Like, Treebeard just kind of walked in and was like, hey, I'm here, fully formed. Like, Tolkien writes of his experience of writing those chapters with the Ents as just kind of coming to him, being an unconscious or subconscious writing, and not him inventing whole cloth. Like, this again speaks to his relationship to the text as like a compiler or a translator. Like, he is happening upon historical events and collating them into a collected text for us to read. He's not positioning himself as the owner, the arbiter, the inventor, the creator here. He is communicating that the text was fully formed, it just needed a channel to flow through, and he happened to be that channel. In 1956, Tolkien wrote, "I hope that you have enjoyed The Lord of the Rings." Enjoyed is the key word, for it was written to amuse, in the highest sense, to be readable. There is no allegory, moral, political, or contemporary in the work at all. So again, here he's repeating, it's not an allegory, please, do not mistake me, it's not an allegory. But he's also saying that his kind of main aim, what is most important to him, is that people enjoy it. That people are having a good time. People are having fun. That seems very important to Tolkien. And it turns out that queer people having fun with this text is part of the fandom now. In 1956 again, he wrote, "Something of the teller's own reflections and values will inevitably get worked in. This is not the same as allegory. We all, in groups or as individuals, exemplify general principles, but we do not represent them." So to me, this points directly to Wolfgang Iser and reader response theory and the positioning of readers as individuals who bring their own experience to the text in the same way that an author brings their experience to the text. They can't help but do that. But I think Tolkien is again pointing to, even if I did bring my experience to this text, or even if the reader is bringing their own experience to this text, that does not mean it's a purposeful allegory. That does not preclude anyone from reading this text in any certain type of way that makes sense to them. We exemplify general principles, but we do not represent them. Like, Tolkien lived his life to exemplify the values of Catholicism, but his work does not necessarily represent them. In 1956 again, Tolkien wrote, "I believe that it is precisely because I did not try, and have never thought of trying to objectify my personal experience of life, that the account of the Quest of the Ring is successful in giving pleasure to Auden and others. The story is not about J.R.R. at all, and is at no point an attempt to allegorize his experience of life." This is another very obvious example of what I'm pointing directly at here. He was not inserting his personal experience. He was not trying to objectify his personal experience. He was giving an account of the Quest of the Ring, and his aim was to have people enjoy it, to have fun, to have a good time reading his work. It's fantasy, it's escapism, it's a fairy story. It's not about J.R.R. Tolkien at all. He said it himself. It's right there. It's right there! In 1957, Tolkien wrote, "There is no symbolism or conscious allegory in my story. That there is no allegory does not, of course, say that there is not applicability. There always is. But I should say, if asked, the tale is not really about power and dominion. That only sets the wheels going. It's about death, and the desire for deathlessness. which is hardly more than to say it is a tale written by a man. So here Tolkien is poking fun at his own mortality and saying, like, if you want to read anything into this, keep in mind that it was written by a man, and so it's very much concerned with being thrown towards death. Like, it's not about him personally. It doesn't really have anything to do with his personal values beyond a consistent and conscious preoccupation with death, which I certainly share. I don't know about you, but yep. This next passage includes Elvish, which I do not speak, so bear with me. In 1958, Tolkien wrote, "Nobody believes me when I say that my long book is an attempt to create a world in which a form of language agreeable to my personal aesthetic might seem real. But it is true. An inquirer among many asked what The Lord of the Rings was all about, and whether it was an allegory. And I said it was an effort to create a situation in which a common greeting would be Ellen sila lumen omentienmo." And that the phrase long antedated the book. So Tolkien basically is like, I wanted to write a world where people spoke Elvish, and it got kind of out of hand. Like, the man was a linguist. He was obsessed with linguistics and language, and his own sense of kind of like aesthetic pleasure was very much derived from languages and how they feel and how they sound. So, and like how they're shaped. Like, he talks a lot about the shape of language. It's fascinating. I'm gonna get into it in a different video, I'm sure. But he basically is like, it's a fanfic. Like, I wanted to make a world where this situation is possible.
What's he saying?
And that's what he did. So he finds pleasure in language and the quality of language, and that's basically his impetus in writing Lord of the Rings. Like, he wasn't trying to craft a vehicle for a religious message, beep beep. He was straight up being like, how do I make a story so that this language I created has a place to fit and a place to be used and people to speak and interact with each other and make use of this language I've created. Like, what a nerd. In 1958, Tolkien wrote, "I object to the contemporary trend in criticism with this excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and artists. They only distract attention from an author's works, if the works are in fact worthy of attention, and end, as one now often sees, in becoming the main interest." He objects. He says, don't do that. Excessive interest in the lives of authors and artists. It distracts attention from the work. It becomes the main interest. Do you see what we're getting at here? How inserting Tolkien into the work is a distraction from the work itself? How it pulls focus from the pleasure that Tolkien was looking to engender? Are you still with me? I hope so, because there's more. Towards the end of the 50s, in 1959, Tolkien wrote, "I have no didactic purpose and no allegorical intent. I do not like allegory, properly so called. Most readers appear to confuse it with significance or applicability, but that is a matter too long to deal with here." The significance or applicability of a text does not make it allegorical. He says this over and over. The least we can do is listen to the man. He's basically writing himself hoarse over the course of a decade, saying, please, it's not an allegory. Please, it's not an allegory. Please don't insert me into this text. Please, it's not about me. It has nothing to do with me. Like, if you read his letters and you understand what he said in them, and you continue to say that his Catholicism or his faith is the most essential aspect to unlocking a valid reading of Lord of the Rings, I think you need to go back and read it again, hun, because you missed some spots. In 1967, Tolkien wrote, "It must be emphasized that this process of invention was and is a private enterprise undertaken to give pleasure to myself by giving expression to my personal linguistic aesthetic or taste and its fluctuations." So again, Tolkien is here outlining that his intent, if any, was pleasure. It was his own pleasure in realizing his literary and linguistic aesthetic. Like, he invented these languages and then needed a world to put them in. And that's it. Like, for him, that's enough. And if it's enough for Tolkien, it should be enough for us as readers, right? Yeah, right. Like, I'm right. Finally, in 1971, Tolkien wrote, "Of course the Lord of the Rings does not belong to me. It has been brought forth, and must now go its appointed way in the world, though naturally I take a deep interest in its fortunes, as a parent would of a child." He's being so explicit here. Of course it does not belong to him. It never really did belong to him. Tolkien sees himself as the channel through which this story has been communicated. He sees the languages and the methods of communication that he invented as kind of the realizing force behind the rest of the story. Without Tolkien's conception of his own linguistic aesthetic and his own pursuit of pleasure, we wouldn't have The Lord of the Rings. So attempting to insert any kind of allegorical meaning or source of intent beyond this very simple sense of pleasure is to do the work a major disservice. Tolkien here clearly outlines his feelings. The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. It's not meant to be a reflection of J.R.R. Tolkien himself. It does not belong to him. Did he want to be involved in the text as a significant interpretative guideline? I think it's pretty clear that he did not believe that invoking him or his biography promoted a better or more valid reading of his work. Did he offer up a rich fantasy world, and did he distance himself from being the owner or arbiter of that world to leave ample room for readers to engage with it and play in it and enjoy it? Yes, he did. So, we have established that different people can read the same text in different ways and for different reasons. Readers bring intentionality to the act of decoding texts, interacting with them, and participating in them. We have established that Tolkien didn't really see himself as being in the driver's seat, and that he didn't purposefully include any intention or allegory, so much so that parts of the story flowed through him rather than from him. But what was his intent? To continue that Peter Jabot letter we were looking at earlier, one of my strongest opinions is that investigation of an author's biography is an entirely vain and false approach to his works, and especially to a work of narrative art, of which the object aimed at by the author was to be enjoyed as such, to be read with literary pleasure. The letter is pretty clear-cut. He intended for his readers to find their own pleasure in this text, in this work of narrative art, not necessarily to glean pleasure from his involvement in it. We have by now established that when he did state an intention in writing Lord of the Rings, it was to inspire pleasure in his readers. The escapism of a fantasy text mixed with the active and creative pleasure of the reading experience. Pleasure, plain and simple. And this idea of literary pleasure is one that sticks with me as I observe fandom spaces online, particularly this one. The presence of multiple unreliable and biased narrators in The Lord of the Rings leaves a lot of fun space to play in when reading, and queer fans on Twitter recognize this space for play and for possibility. They emphasize the generally understood importance of the relationships among characters, and relate a spectrum of textual interpretations that often include direct quotes to support their readings. By respecting the nature of the canon and enjoying the text as it is, without projecting an external belief system like Catholicism onto it, queer fans get a satisfying sense of literary pleasure. Simply put, to insert Tolkien himself into the text of The Lord of the Rings is to interpret the text in a way that is directly opposed to his intent, and trad fans are very attached to their ideas of Tolkien's intentions. Such interpretations reduce Tolkien, a complicated and flawed human man, to a one-dimensional projection whose Catholicism completely eclipses any capacity for creativity and critical work outside of a religious ideology that is somehow both rigid and constantly changing to fit the needs of its followers. Tolkien was undeniably a man of faith, and he remained admirably committed to his faith throughout his life. He was a learned man, and he gave much thought, at least in his correspondence, to the nature of faith and its influence on his life. However, Saying that Tolkien's Catholicism precludes Lord of the Rings from being a secular text, or that it guarantees some essentially Christian nature of the text, is a big leap. And it wholly discounts Tolkien's own protestations that Lord of the Rings is neither an allegory nor a vehicle for a religious message. Relate to the man if he shares your faith. Sure, please, go ahead. But project that faith onto the text and its characters, especially when the man himself said not to? That doesn't seem like sincere concern for Tolkien's legacy and the preservation of his authorial intent. That's more like using your religion's generalized reputation to promote a political agenda on social media. Demeaning enthusiastic readers and fans based on their sexuality or identity divides any fandom, and in the case of Lord of the Rings, it works to destroy Tolkien's legacy far more efficiently than suggesting that Frodo and Sam love each other in a gay way. Insisting that Tolkien's religion is the most important aspect of his identity as a writer reduces him to one dimension, and this, to me, is far more likely to have the man rolling in his grave than letting hobbits kiss. There's a great hypocrisy at the core of the trad Lord of the Rings fandom, and it comes to light with alarming frequency on Twitter. They talk a lot about Tolkien's legacy and the integrity of his work, but they do not tend to listen to the man's own words on how the text works within its own canon and how to glean that all-important literary pleasure from it. Trad fans prefer to co-opt Tolkien's biography to fit their needs so they can feel justified in trying to exclude queer people from enjoying Tolkien's work. The Lord of the Rings is the archetypal high fantasy text. It is genre-defining, and the presence of sincere and earnest love between men as a major aspect of this story both destigmatizes this kind of love for anyone who might be kind of nervous about a man kiss another man on the forehead, and provides ample room for this love to take on many forms and labels as new fans interact with the text and identify with it, regardless of their age, sexuality, identity, or beliefs. Interpretation evolves and speaks to a timeless quality that keeps old fans coming back and new fans engaged. I have offered here canonical reinforcement to support queer readings of the text, because reading Frodo and Sam as actually gay with a capital A and a capital G is easy to do, and queer fans have a lot of fun doing it. Limiting interpretative possibilities to those defined by Tolkien's religious beliefs isn't just directly opposed to what Tolkien himself said about how to read his work. It's exclusionary, it's gatekeeping, and it can prevent people from enjoying the rich world he relates in these texts. Queer fans have embraced the Lord of the Rings story and taken to the internet to enjoy it, and that impulse is the heart of Tolkien's concept of literary pleasure. The potential for different flavors and varieties of literary pleasure does not have an upper limit. The limit does not exist. Which is why queer fans and trad fans can exist in such volumes within the same fandom. It is in the ways of reading, in their interpretative choices and the resulting discourse, that such pleasure can become jeopardized and turn fandom spaces from inclusive and fun playgrounds into contentious and dreary battlegrounds. If we really want to respect the lore, we can listen to Tolkien's carefully crafted canonical intentions and try not to exclude other people from enjoying his work. I would like to be clear here. Queer people enjoying The Lord of the Rings by talking about how Frodo and Sam are gay is not excluding trad fans from enjoying Lord of the Rings. It's just a different conversation in the same room. And if you choose to get involved in a conversation that has nothing to do with you, and you get your feelings hurt, I would say that's on you. Queer people see themselves in Lord of the Rings, and that is not a mistake or a reach. Queer fans don't tend to tell trad fans that reading Catholicism into Lord of the Rings is destroying Tolkien's legacy and directly disrespectful to the man himself. But trad fans feel comfortable doing so to queer fans as a way of interfering with their literary pleasure? I don't think so, bud.
You blew it. Capiche?
Tolkien's intent was to inspire literary pleasure, and he left us a really fun, loose canon to play with. Stubborn resistance to queer interpretation limits our potential for understanding and enjoying Tolkien's work, and the fandom renaissance on Twitter in the past couple years has helped to bust through these limits, whether trad fans like it or not. Fandom, at the end of the day, is a community. Fandom helps people find each other. And the widespread love for Tolkien coming from queer people speaks volumes about the content of the text. It also speaks to the significance of queer community, as many fans learned more about the text and felt comfortable interacting with it because of the support they found among other queer fans in the Lord of the Rings fandom on Twitter. Fandom is a community, and queer people finding community in fandom is something to celebrate, not deride. Queer representation is there because we see it. If we as queer people feel seen and understood by the relationships presented in this text, that counts. That's literary pleasure, baby, and that's what Tolkien was aiming for. The passionate and unapologetic queerness of the Lord of the Rings fandom renaissance on Twitter is a form of queer joy as well as literary pleasure, bolstering Tolkien's stated intentions and honoring his legacy in the process. And that is what I would call respecting the lore. Thank you. Thank you for watching! This is my first ever video essay, and it took me forever to make. I presented this paper at a symposium last year, and I had more to say beyond the 15-minute limit I was given. So the tale grew in the telling. I ended up putting this together and basically reading you an essay into a camera, which I promise I'll never do again, but I have a lifelong hyperfixation on Lord of the Rings, and alongside my academic background and my digital research interests, all of it means that I love Tolkien trash. So you can expect some close readings, some analysis of the movies, the Rings of Power TV show, whatever, more stuff about the digital fandom and its dynamics and its activity. Yeah, pretty much anything vaguely related to Tolkien that I feel like talking about, that's what we're here to do. So thank you again for spending this time with me. I really appreciate you, and I love you very much. I'll see you soon.